All right, today we're diving deep into the very building blocks of life itself. We're talking about the cells that make up two of Earth's biggest kingdoms, plants and animals. We're going to unpack a real tale of two cells.
I mean, think about it. A giant redwood tree and a cheetah. On the surface, yeah, the difference is pretty obvious, right? One is just rooted to the spot, reaching for the sun, and the other is this blur of speed and muscle. But the real story, the source code that makes them so different, you can't see it. It all starts way, way down at the microscopic level, in the design of their cells.
And just to give you a sense of scale here, because we usually think of cells as being tiny, right? Well, get this. The largest single animal cell is an unfertilized ostrich egg. It weighs in at a whopping 1.5 kilograms. So yeah, from the totally microscopic to the, well, massive, it all starts from a shared blueprint.
Okay, so before we start picking them apart, it's super important to remember that plant and animal cells are actually part of the same big family. They're both eukaryotic cells. You can think of it like they're built from the same basic car chassis. They just have very different options and packages installed. So this is kind of the standard equipment that comes in every model. You've got the nucleus, that's the command center holding all the DNA. You have the cell membrane, which is like a bouncer at the door controlling who gets in and out. Of course, you've got the mitochondria, the famous powerhouse of the cell. And then there's a whole factory line of other parts for building stuff, packaging it, and cleaning up messes. This is their shared DNA, literally and figuratively.
So if they have all of this stuff in common, where do they go their separate ways? Well, it all comes down to just a few key differences. But trust me, these are not minor details. These are the differences that lead to two totally separate ways of surviving on this planet.
And the first big split, you could argue it's the most important one, boils down to two really simple questions. How do you build yourself? And where do you get your lunch? And this is where we see two totally different life strategies. On one side, you have plants. They're autotrophs. It basically means self-feeder. They literally make their own food just by soaking up sunlight. Then you have animals, including us. We're heterotrophs, which means we have to get our energy by eating other things. And believe me, that one single difference changes absolutely everything. So how does that affect how they're built? Well, a plant cell builds a super rigid cell wall out of cellulose. It's like a tiny fortress built around itself. That's what gives plants their structure, what makes wood tough, and what lets a redwood tree stand hundreds of feet tall without collapsing. An animal cell, it just has that flexible membrane. That means it can be all sorts of squishy, weird shapes, and, this is the key part, it can move. And the special tool that lets plants pull this off? It's an incredible little organelle called a chloroplast. You can just think of these as tiny, solar-powered sugar factories inside every plant cell. Animal cells, we don't have them, no chloroplasts. So we have to get our sugar the old-fashioned way, by eating plants or eating something that ate a plant.
Now, here's something that trips a lot of people up. They think, okay, plants have chloroplasts, animals have mitochondria, but that's not quite right. Plants actually have both. It's a two-step process. Step 1, the chloroplasts use sunlight to make the sugar. Then step 2, their mitochondria, just like ours, break down that sugar to release the energy. It's a perfect self-contained energy system. Pretty neat, huh?
All right, so we've covered the big ones, structure and energy. But there are a few other special tools that each type of cell has in its toolkit, perfectly designed for its way of life. Okay, let's talk storage. Animal cells have a bunch of small vacuoles. You can think of them like little storage lockers for different jobs. But a plant cell? Nope. It has one giant central vacuole. And it's not just for storing water. When that thing is full, it pushes out against the cell wall, creating what's called turgor pressure. That pressure is what keeps a plant from wilting. It's basically a water-powered skeleton. And when I say giant, I mean giant. This vacuole can take up as much as 90% of the entire cell's volume. It literally shoves all the other important bits and pieces right up against the edges. So both cells have an internal skeleton, right? A kind of scaffolding called the cytoskeleton. But animal cells have this special little pair of things called centrioles. They're like the main construction foreman for that skeleton, and they're super important when it's time for the cell to divide. Most plants, they don't have them. They just kind of organize things from lots of smaller sites. They get the job done just in a different way. This one's pretty straightforward. Since plant cells are locked inside those rigid walls, they don't really go anywhere. They're stationary. The only real exception is for some of their reproductive cells, which might need to swim. Animal cells, on the other hand, are all about movement. Lots of them have cilia. Think of them like thousands of tiny little oars. Or a flagellum, which is like a long whip-like tail. The most famous example, of course, is a sperm cell.
What about the cleanup crew? Well, animal cells have these very specialized organelles called lysosomes, which are basically little recycling centers. Now, for a long, long time, scientists thought plants just didn't have them. It turns out that giant vacuole we talked about can do a lot of that same work. And honestly, the science is still a little fuzzy. It's still being debated whether some plant cells might have them. It's a great example of how science is always learning and updating what we know.
And finally, cells don't live in isolation, right? They need to communicate with their neighbors. For a plant cell, this is tricky because of that big wall. So they have these special channels called plasmodesmata that poke right through the walls, connecting them. Animal cells have an easier time of it. They use something called a gap junction, which is basically a direct channel connecting two cells so they can share stuff and send signals back and forth.
Okay, that was a lot of detail. So let's zoom out and look at the big picture. Why does any of this tiny microscopic stuff actually matter? You know, it all boils down to one of the most beautiful principles in all of biology. Form follows function. Every single difference we just talked about is a brilliant solution to a problem of survival. That rigid wall, it lets a plant stand still and grow tall. That flexible membrane, it lets an animal move and hunt. Those chloroplasts, they turn a plant into a self-sufficient factory. Not having them forces an animal to be a mobile consumer. None of this is random. It's the product of billions of years of trial and error.
And that just leaves you with this incredible thought, doesn't it? A handful of tiny, microscopic differences. And that's all it takes to create the entire, vast, sprawling kingdoms of plants and animals. It really makes you wonder, what other huge secrets are still hiding down there in the tiny blueprints of life?